Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome to this FairWay Kotahitanga webinar on moving on from conflict, learnings from bullying and harassment cases. My name is Samantha de Coning, and I'm the Head of Practice at FairWay. And with me today are members of our workplace team, Stephen Hooper, Kate Haley, and Kate Hesson. Welcome, Stephen.
Morning, everybody. I'm Stephen Hooper. I'm one of FairWay's Wellington team. I'm one of the workplace mediators and facilitators within FairWay, and I've worked with numerous government departments and commercial teams to help them through both bullying and workplace issues.
Tēnā koutou everyone, I'm Kate Haley and I'm part of FairWay's Christchurch or Aotearoa team in workplace services, and I work in the facilitation, mediation and investigation space.
Kia ora tātou, my name is Kate Hesson. I'm beaming in from Otipoti, otherwise known as Dunedin. I'm an investigator and I also conduct facilitations and mediations like the other members of our workplace services team. So it's my pleasure to really be able to help people see the whole end-to-end solution and holistic conversation that we're going to have today.
Welcome, Stephen, Kate, and Kate. Just for the attendees, we are recording today's session and a link to the recording will be forwarded to you. We welcome your questions. Please pop those into the chat below and there'll be time for us to look at those at the end of the presentation. Getting back to our topic for today's discussion, a recent nationwide survey conducted by the Human Rights Commission states that a significant 40% of workers report being bullied in their working life. We all know that the impact of bullying is far-reaching, with those surveyed staff reporting an immediate impact on their well-being, mental health, self-confidence, and their career prospects. However, once an investigation or mediation is over, organisations are faced with the task of supporting the people concerned within the workplace, including those involved directly in the case, as well as the wider team. Today, Stephen, Kate, and Kate will share their thoughts on how organisations can move on from conflict, learn from it, and address the underlying drivers in order to restore important relationships and prevent further conflict. Stephen, before we do that, what are some of the trends that the HR Commission's report highlighted, and what are you seeing in the workplace?
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. As you've mentioned, a couple of recent government reports have sadly confirmed that in New Zealand we have a significant problem with bullying behaviour in our schools and also in our workplaces. As Samantha has mentioned, that Human Rights National Survey states that about 40% of workers report being bullied in their working life, and about 20% of that cluster within the last 12 months. In addition, about 44% of all staff have reported witnessing other colleagues being bullied. These figures are quite consistent with the material that we've now received from the Ministry of Business, which indicates that about 16% of the Ministry's employment relations matters that have been mediated over the last 12 months involve bullying cases. These statistics certainly seem to indicate that bullying and intimidation in the workplace has become a fairly serious problem. So what is it? What is bullying? There is no specific definition in the Employment Relations Act. However, since bullying has the potential to cause mental and physical as well as emotional harm to employees, bullying allegations and complaints are usually caught within the employer's obligation as fair and reasonable employers who are responsible for providing a safe working environment. If you're looking for some material that's quite useful, the material on the WorkSafe New Zealand site is really excellent. It provides a very good definition of what's called their good practices guides that have been developed by WorkSafe. We really recommend these. These guidelines have been adopted by the Employment Relations Authority and the Employment Court as the sort of standard criteria for bullying. WorkSafe's definition of bullying is repeated and unreasonable behaviour directed towards a worker or a group of workers that can lead to physical or psychological harm. What this definition emphasises is the need for repeated and persistent actions over time. Involves victimisation, humiliation, intimidation, or threats. It does not involve one-off or occasional instances of tactless or rude behaviour, setting of high standards on performance, providing constructive feedback, advice or reasonable instructions, or even warnings or disciplinary action. The definition of bullying therefore creates this demarcation between reasonable management, differences of opinion, and even clashes and differences of viewpoint, and those that escalate into intimidation, harassment, or violence. As we'll discuss in a moment, this definition occasionally means that some issues that have been raised as bullying complaints actually relate more to things like incivility, miscommunications, breakdown in workplace relationships, and even the loss of trust. However, whether bullying allegations are proven or complaints fall short of the definition, these issues will invariably leave a legacy that impacts team functioning and workplace connections. The Human Rights Commission also goes on to talk a little bit around some of the impacts of bullying. It reminds us that the impacts of bullying, as Samantha has mentioned, can be quite far-reaching. The surveyed staff reported an immediate impact on their well-being, their mental health, their self-confidence, and as Samantha mentioned, their career prospects. Unfortunately, this report states that about 29% of workers will not report those allegations of bullying. This is because they often fear the consequences of raising their concerns. They distrust the internal systems to maintain confidentiality, or they feel that they simply won't be believed. They're more likely to talk to family and friends rather than use the internal workplace systems. In fact, less than a quarter of all workers who experience bullying will even raise a complaint. And sadly, just under half of that group report dissatisfaction with the outcome once they've decided to speak up to people within their organization. What these employees have told the Commission is that what they wanted was more support, but preferably from an independent and free service. In recent months, as a result, several government ministries have partnered with us at FairWay to establish independent speak up programs. These external processes support employees to feel comfortable and safe to raise issues, concerns, or questions about their colleagues' workplace behaviours, conduct, or activities. It also enables managers, staff, and employers to proactively manage the health and safety risks and to minimise some of the emotional damage and mental health impacts of these issues of bullying.
Thank you, Stephen. Kate, when there's an allegation of bullying and/or harassment, what typically happens?
It's a really good question, Samantha. And obviously it depends on the nature of the organisation and the complaint involved. But commonly we see that an allegation of bullying can be made informally or informally. In reality, they often begin with comments that are made quietly to co-workers or between managers and co-workers in terms of phrases like, I'm finding so-and-so puts me down a lot, or I'm being embarrassed in front of the team by so-and-so. And a common response to such comments is, oh, that's just them being them. They've always been like that. Basically, you just have to put up with it, get used to it. Obviously, those responses aren't that helpful and can lead to a process of escalation, which ends up with a formal investigation. Perhaps a better way of dealing with such incidences at that level is to consider coaching. For both people involved or for the group involved. For example, for let's say the person we call the complainant in this situation, coaching to upskill them on how to set boundaries and to discuss them with their co-workers is really helpful. On the other hand, coaching for the alleged bully can be useful. You would focus in that situation on how the alleged bully needs to relate to his or her co-workers in a respectful manner, according to values perhaps set by your whole team. Often a whole team value building session can help if you don't want to single out the individuals involved. Commonly, the next level of response we see involves a person making a time to have a meeting with their manager about the so-called bully. Perhaps this has been precipitated by a series of incidents which together have combined to damage the relationship between the co-workers. Or maybe there's been one too many small things and one major event has occurred, like the straw that breaks the camel's back. At that stage, I call that an informal allegation, and that's often where HR gets involved, if there is in fact an HR division within the organisation we're talking about. An allegation at this level should be dealt with by a facilitated meeting between the individuals involved. Depending on the size of the organisation, the facilitator could be an internal staff member, but it's key to ensure that that person is distant enough from the individuals to maintain independence and to not show bias. It's also key that this person has skills to navigate difficult conversations, particularly and increasingly in our group at FairWay. We're finding that people don't have those skills and are recognising that people like us are indeed valid and add value to these situations. And that's why I'd say another option is to consider engaging an external person like myself, Kate, Stephen or Samantha with such skills. Often managers who are faced with informal allegations like this don't know how to deal with them. Sometimes if they're not skilled, like I mentioned, they can make mistakes, which is even just slips of the tongue, or they can be invested themselves because this reflects on their career prospects within the organisation. And that can aggravate the situation and encourage a formal complaint to be made. On the other hand, sometimes they rush in really quickly to encourage a formal complaint to be made so that somebody else is involved to deal with the problem because it's just too tough for them. And often that's the truth, and that's why it's because it hasn't been dealt with at an early stage, the problem has bubbled and surfaced into this escalation. Investigations by their very nature are not pleasant. And even if you get pleasant people like me as an investigator, who do strive to do as little harm as possible, there's always fallout, which we will discuss further on in this webinar. So in my view, you should only really use investigations when they are truly necessary. You really need to consider the fallout, which can include decreasing trust between co-workers even further. The lack of trust spreads to people who are not in the centre of the complaint as well. When I've interviewed witnesses, they've often come away feeling fairly traumatised themselves, and then they've probably gone and talked to co-workers who are beyond the sphere of the investigation, despite obligations of confidentiality being expressed and things like that. It's just human nature. Sometimes I see that formal investigations are like using a sledgehammer to hit a nail. For example, earlier this year, I conducted an investigation in a school that for a variety of reasons took 6 long months. And I didn't want to be involved for that 6 long months either. It involved a cross complaint about a group of teachers accusing each other of bullying. None of them wanted management to confront the co-workers with their issues. So management's hands were tied. They felt that they needed to engage an external investigator. I ended up needing to interview past, existing and new co-workers to understand the root causes of the issues. I found that no one was technically bullied, and if anything, it was simply a case of various professionals having different styles of doing their work, and actually a power struggle between 2 strong personalities. They were relationship and culture issues which should have been dealt with earlier by management. To that effect, I gave recommendations to the board who engaged me, and I discussed other options management could have pursued. My strongest recommendation was that there should have been a facilitated conversation between the group as soon as the first relationship issues were raised with management. In cases where people are reluctant to participate, as I mentioned earlier, often it's better to maybe just have a team-wide session so individuals aren't, highlighted. And in fact, what is happening now is that one of my colleagues is conducting a facilitation some 6 months later because the fallout from that investigation has been that damaging to the relationships in the team. The outcome of that investigation was that no bullying incidents were found. And when that happens, it can be particularly disheartening for all involved because it takes a lot of effort, it's disruptive, and there's a financial cost plus a social cost. And no result is really achieved. In fact, things are often left worse than when you first came in. And it's not very satisfying for an investigator either. But when a bully remains in the team, that's even more difficult. But inevitably it happens if there is a no bullying result of the investigation.
Thank you, Kate and Stephen, for defining what bullying is and importantly, what it isn't, and highlighting the complications that an investigation process brings with it. Kate, what have you noticed in this space?
So I guess what springs to mind for me is really what is going on for these organisations when there are claims and counterclaims of bullying, but they don't reach that threshold set by WorkSafe. The research that I have found really useful to understand this is Christine Porath's work on civility, or actually incivility in the workplace, as Stephen has already referenced. Incivility is defined as the accumulation of thoughtless actions that leave employees feeling disrespected, intentionally ignored, undermined or belittled by both their colleagues and management. The research on the effects of incivility actually parallels the Human Rights Commission's finding. So like bullying, workplace incivility has a direct influence on both those tangible and intangible measurements. And it shows up as poor performance, employee turnover, poor teamwork, which obviously leads into a negative customer experience. Fortunately, this research also provides a level of granularity about the behaviours that erode our relationships. So it offers us some direction on how we can improve. Perhaps some of the less obvious examples of incivility are ignoring invitations, perhaps to a workplace social event, perhaps like Christmas drinks, which is very relevant at the moment. Not acknowledging somebody when they walk into the room, or often I've seen in cases something even more subtle when people go out of their way to take a different route to their office to avoid saying hello to somebody. Using email to communicate when a face-to-face conversation is more appropriate. And of course, email and texting during a meeting. And somehow I think most of us have at least been tempted to do this, particularly when we meet online so much more at the moment. If you're curious about how you would score in terms of your incivility level, there is an online assessment in Christine Porath's website, and it provides you some guidance on how well you're doing. I certainly came away from doing my assessment with a few insights on areas I can work on. The primary reason for incivility is stress. So it's really easy to see how these behaviours become a norm when we're working in an under-resourced environment. The good news is that this research suggests that incivility arises more from ignorance and not malice. So the behaviour really reflects a lack of self-awareness, particularly when we communicate using a method that is low in non-verbal cues, such as email. And I'm sure as practitioners, we're seeing this with almost every conflict at the moment being a big contributing factor. So perhaps where incivility differs from bullying is that it's actually defined by the recipient. It's not whether people were disrespected, but it's whether or not they felt disrespected. And what this means is that Porath's research really nudges us to reconsider how we show up for each other and how we are unintentionally shaping our workplace culture. In terms of investigations, I want to share a case that highlights some of the elements that Kate's raised earlier, and we've sort of acknowledged this morning that even the best designed determinative process is subject to those delays, and Kate cited 6 months. And they have the potential to leave people feeling really unsupported. The feedback from most parties involved, even if they're just witnesses, suggests that they need more support than counselling-based services to offset the rigors of the investigation process. And very clearly we see when there's that gap of information and that paucity of support for those involved, people actually fill that gap and they fill it with assumptions, and we literally watch people becoming more entrenched in their positions as the investigation process rolls on. So this case study highlights what steps were taken by an organisation to reform a team. I was recently involved in a building industry case where management needed to reintegrate an employee into the team after a suspension and disciplinary process. The case was complex because there were underlying community and family ties in this conflict. The employee clearly blamed his colleague for the disciplinary action. And of course, we've got the usual workplace speculation about the confidential process, and all of this had fueled team division even further. So by acknowledging that there's a tension that the investigation caused, the organisation asked for a process that dedicated time to bring the team back together. And what resulted was a series of facilitated conversations spread over a 2-week period. So by actually slowing down, they optimised the chance for everyone to feel heard and be prepared for that joint team meeting. Facilitations between the employee and their manager, and then the employee and a colleague, preempted the team meeting, and the team discussion focused specifically on what good conduct looked like. So as a team of leaders, they were invited to share how they wanted to feel in the workplace and to co-create a strategy of the behaviours that would support and detract from their culture. And the conversation took that existing code of conduct to a much deeper level. The process provided a framework for a robust but vulnerable conversation, and actually, to their credit, there wasn't a lot left on the table at the end of the afternoon. Through this conversation, the team came to a few realizations that the cost of poor workplace culture had led to an increase in self-sabotaging behaviour and an increase in a sense of disconnection in the workplace. And that had fed into them taking more risks on site because they stopped watching out for each other. So for them, the learning from this conversation was really significant. And the team came away with a plan on how to maintain good conduct and culture, which in turn would feed into that workplace safety.
Thank you, Kate. It's really interesting to hear from all of you how, while investigations and other formal interventions play a really important role, what's even more significant is for organizations to focus on how they rebuild their teams and redefine relationships. Stephen, I know that you've prepared some information on this for our attendees. What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Samantha. One of the processes, obviously, that we do use in that process of rebuilding organisations post-investigations or post-allegations being made is either a mediation or facilitation process. Mm-hmm. So we thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit around some of the trends where we have stepped in to help to mediate and facilitate several of these cases over the last few months or so, and in particular looking at how we've kind of helped groups to restore the working relationships following allegations or issues of bullying. Look, not surprisingly, a number of these cases involve issues following instances where key staff members who have been involved in the allegations of bullying have actually now moved on. They've left their former role. In other cases, the allegations have been dealt with, as we've talked a little bit about, through an investigation process, and either the issues haven't been upheld or it's been found that there have been contributions, I guess a degree of incivility, as Kate was talking before, that was evident from several parties and potentially from all sides of what was involved in the particular conflict or issues. And sometimes, as we've been talked about, having gone through that investigation process, the determination is that the conduct that's involved is kind of at that lower end of the scale. And consequently, what HR generally has done, or management's generally done, is suggest that the matter should be addressed by way of an employee or management training or development program. Regardless, I guess, of the outcome of the allegations, what we've discovered is, not surprisingly, is that the organizations are left with a dilemma. And that is, how do we rebuild the relationships within the workplace? I guess place some of those intangible elements like trust, communication, respect onto a firmer footing moving forward. And it's this restoration of the workplace balance and that reconciliation of relationships that is obviously one of the complex legacies that arises as a result of bullying allegations. In those spaces, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the proactive things we can do, but in terms of the actual mediation and facilitation processes, these are some of the ways in which we address some of those workplace issues. I guess Facilitation and mediation has the advantage of enabling groups to be able to return to the workplace and to be able to work together more effectively. From the several cases that we've dealt with, the allegations of bullying will generally obviously involve colleagues, either against managers or staff at either a lower or higher level within the organisation. Often the allegations that we've talked about have been addressed using internal investigations carried out sometimes by higher level managers and sometimes by the HR team. What we've discovered in this process is that by the time they get to us in terms of the mediation or facilitation process, at least in terms of some of the outcomes of the review, has been that they've identified concerns about the manner in which parties are actually interacting or talking to each other. Their discussions have often moved beyond this element of incivility into quite disrespectful and open hostility. What we've seen generally in the process is there's a bit of a continuum that occurs. Often it starts at quite a low level. There has been, we talked a little bit about not attending morning teas or greeting others, but it's gradually developed into more and more complex and problematic behaviours. And if we could just make one comment from an outsider looking in, it would probably be that one of the common problems was the failure of some of their senior leaders to actually handle some of these difficult conversations at the very earliest moments when key staff were starting to deal with some of these issues at a very early moment. It enabled the organisation, if they could have got in at those early moments, to actually prevent the escalation that slowly starts to occur. What has often happened by the time we're involved is the problems have actually spilled over to other staff within the team. Others have been used as sounding boards, or they've taken sides in the conflict. And consequently, what often happens is that the incidents and allegations of bullying have begun to impact teamwork and communication, and it started to extend across a broader range of groups. If there is a common feature of some of the things that we've seen, it's been the problem that gets created with what we sometimes refer to as role ambiguity. This occurs where there's a degree of overlap between particular roles, various responsibilities and roles that individual employees have. It's not generally a problem where parties are communicating and working together well, but where the relationship starts to deteriorate, it can become a source of conflict, either as each individual or their teams begin to look to kind of solidify their positions or engage in patch protection. I guess our hope is that where we have teams working together is that there will be a combination of skills, and namely that the hope is the total team output is greater than the individual parts. We, I guess, hope that 1 + 1 = 4. The alternative is where the combination of skills is less than the individual parts, where 1 + 1 = 1/2 or less. And that occurs when we see a phenomenon known as swimming teams. And that is where individuals or teams perform really well in their own lanes, but work really badly when it comes to collaborating or working effectively across groups. And we sometimes find those issues are some of the common themes. Finally, one of the common themes that we see in this context is that problems have often reached the stage where teamwork and performance has begun to be affected. And so there's often performance issues that are now being tied up in these issues related to bullying. And I guess from an organizational perspective, all of this is no longer sustainable. So I guess the issue, and one of the things that mediation can provide, is enable parties to actually start talking through how are we going to deal with this issue moving forward.
Thanks, Stephen. So it really is a ripple effect when this conflict happens in a workplace. So rather than being reactive, what are some of the proactive strategies or tools that you and the team have used that perhaps attendees today could use in their workplaces to get their teams back on track and to build that important trust?
As I guess we've probably talked about on numerous occasions, there's a bit of a risk of being the ambulance at the bottom of the hill. The advantage obviously is to do some of the preventative things that can be done along the way. And so we have a number of tools available to us within FairWay that help parties to design processes to actually move forward, improve teamwork, communication, either following the investigation process or proactively before things have even arisen. So before we begin the rebuilding process, we would almost always meet with individual parties beforehand. And part of that is actually talking with them around what's combining here to contribute to some of these problems. I guess what impact is some of the issues related to bullying allegations or conflict in general having on individuals or on teams. This will, as both Kates have kind of talked through, highlighted the fact that it is reasonably important for us to talk with a broader range of people because of the breadth of implications for this across the whole team. The outcome of these individual meetings is generally that we design a series of steps that help them to groups to improve trust and hopefully to gradually to rebuild or proactively build team working relationships. Now, having worked with organisations in New Zealand and across the globe, we've been able to identify a series of proactive tools that other groups have found quite helpful to diagnose some of the emerging issues or the issues that have already started to show up and some of the impacts of these. These assessments enable us and obviously organisations to proactively develop appropriate strategies to address some of these early moments or some of these emerging challenges that organisations are facing. One of the first processes we use are called communication audits. And basically what it involves is to actually work with team members to talk about how they make decisions and how they resolve conflicts. It uses tools such as conflict and working styles assessments, as well as a FairWay's piano model to help people to actually identify their preferred ways of working, of communicating or interacting with each other, the strengths and challenges of our working and conflict styles and the impact of these on other team members. Again, used proactively, especially when you're forming new teams, it enables groups to kind of highlight those areas where there are potential risks, where these styles or ways of doing things might clash or create problems. The other tool that we use is called a team effectiveness survey. It's a survey that enables us to look at the degree of interdependence between team members. To want to put it another way, to what extent do team members need to work together to be able to carry out their roles? How do team members coordinate, collaborate, work together to improve the individual or team performance, improve their working relationships, and hopefully improve their well-being moving forward? The Team Effectiveness Survey is very much an early intervention diagnostic tool that enables us to look at three elements of team effectiveness: team and organizational structures, the systems that are in place, the processes that groups use, and then ultimately looking at the wider group cultural context. This assessment enables us to explore some of the issues of effectiveness of the team by looking at the way in which they're all interdependent in their roles. It highlights also what we talked about in terms of that role ambiguity issue, where there are inconsistencies or a lack of clarity in the expectations between members and staff as to what their job involves and where they need to interact. It enables us to look at three areas. The first one's team structures. What is the mission and purpose of the team that Kate's going to talk about in a moment? Why does the group exist? What are some of the values, the goals, the policies that are in place, right down to why would you choose to work in this particular group? What are some of the values that attracted you to the role? And then ultimately, what are some of the impacts of these on the issues that we're seeing emerge at the moment? The second issue is to focus rather than on the kind of what is done, but the team processes. It's the how decisions are made. How do people solve problems, make decisions, resolve conflicts as they arise? Are the processes you use systematic? Do people speak openly? What are some of the barriers that are in place to sharing information or collaborating or making joint decisions? And then finally, the broader issue of team culture. What does the wider organizational culture do to support either more well-being or flexibility in the workplace, and ultimately other things that are being done that promote some of the behaviors that we're starting to see emerge here? The last of the tools we use is called a team building processes, including a process called team trust cards. Look, almost one of the inevitable impacts of bullying complaints and allegations is the deterioration in workplace trust. And we all recognize that trust is one of those kind of vital elements for working together. But what we have discovered, having worked around the world on this particular issue, is that individuals' understanding of what trust is often is quite different from their colleagues. And so what we do is use the trust cards to look at this different meaning of trust, to explore what causes trust to be damaged within the team, and then ultimately what steps the organization can do to rebuild trust. The advantage of all of these diagnostic tools is that they help organizations to proactively identify any elements that might be contributing to the challenges or conflicts, or potentially providing, for want of a better term, a life support system for the issues that the group's actually facing. So these assessments enable us to identify and resolve the underlying issues rather than some of those surface problems. And so we use these tools and assessments to focus our discussions with teams, because our goal ultimately is to get to the real causes as well as the wider impacts of the workplace challenges, and deal with some of the issues related to team relationships, teamwork, and trust. Obviously, we use those as a foundation in mediation and also in facilitation processes to enable us to work out what steps can be taken to address these issues. What can we do moving forward to rebuild workplace relationships?
Thank you, Stephen. That's been really useful, and really highlights those different levels, from incivility, bad behavior, all the way through to bullying. But the reality is that regardless of the level, there's always an impact on the team and a cost for organizations. And thinking about this and learning from conflict, Kate, how can businesses build this information into their strategies?
Well, Samantha, it's all about being proactive, but also being honest about the problems that are occurring or could occur in your organization. I think that businesses and organizations really need to prioritize people-related risks, just as they prioritize things like cybersecurity, climate change, all those financial risks. And you don't often see a separate risk framework to deal with people problems at a governance level. And I think if people actually turn their minds to doing that, they will then have a better chance of avoiding such problems as we've been talking about today. Businesses and organizations should put information that they learned from investigations or facilitations, or even the tools that Stephen has just been referring to, into the risk management framework. I would be so bold as to say that you need to have a separate one on people-related risks that are then brought into your overall risk framework for your organization. And so that commonly organizations revisit their strategy every year, maybe biannually. At the same time, they should consider all their risk frameworks, because strategy and risk are often considered two sides of the same coin. If you do that, then your organization will be able to consciously resource these problems, preventing them from happening. And if they do happen, mitigate and minimize the damage that's caused. I think in our experience, what we've found when talking to HR people, professionals within organizations, is that sometimes they struggle to get traction from higher up, whether it's at the board level or in senior executive management, for such things to be seen as a genuine business risk. But when an organization goes through something as damaging as an investigation and then the fallout that we've been describing earlier, then they learn that it is a serious risk to business, lack of engagement, risk to reputation out in the marketplace, not being able to attract new top quality people, all those kind of things. So it is a valid risk and something that needs to be considered. Obviously, before you can manage a risk, you need to understand what causes it. So not only think about what can be learned post an investigation, but also be proactive. And so it's really good and sensible business practice to run those kind of communication audits, team effectiveness surveys regularly. You need to consider other factors in your business and think about what is appropriate for the nature and level of whether you're in your client or you are an SME. It's going to be different from whether you're local government entity or a large national company. But the key factors to look at are whether there's a culture of trust, how good the relationships are within your organization, and the level of collaboration, which often is translated into how effective are communication channels. There need to be clear systems and expectations around managing workload and role descriptions that clearly match the reality of what is happening in your team. And if they don't match the reality, then maybe you need to work on even some reorganization within your team of workflows, etc. It's essential that you have clear channels of communications and a process by which, if somebody does have a concern, they know where to go to with that concern. Before, when I talked about the levels of formality of people bringing up, say, bullying complaints, it's really good to have within your policies, not just what is bullying and it's not acceptable in our organisation. I mean, quite frankly, who is going to find that bullying is acceptable? But the key thing within your policy is to back it up with a process or procedure that's documented and is available for everybody to access within your organisation. Again, that's a factor of communication, that we keep things transparent and people know what to do when they've got a problem. I think you need to also consider, think outside the box, think about running team training on better communication, for example, before you actually need it. Think about having a coaching resource available to all your staff, in addition to EAP, for example, as part of your wellbeing package. Coaching is skill-based and is proactive and can be timely. So it's actually better for better bang for your buck as an organisation than EAP, in my view. A famous mediator that we all love to refer to at FairWay, Ken Cloak, said that, and I'm going to actually have to read my notes here, conflict occurs at the crossroads of a problem that needs to be solved and the skills that parties have or don't have to manage that conversation. If you plan ahead within a risk management framework and give your team skills to have effective relationships at work, you will be mitigating and managing the risk of dysfunctional relationships, which can escalate into bullying complaints.
Thank you, Kate. So while investigations do have a place, they are not the only avenue open to organisations. And when things go wrong, I think it's quite clear from the panel that the advice is talk to your expert or advisor about what the options are and explore these. When formal processes are used, organisations then need to focus on the what now. How are you going to rebuild connection and trust in your teams? After the session today, we're going to be sending you some resources to support the development of your own end-to-end conflict solution. But I'd like to thank Stephen, Kate, and Kate for your valuable insights. And we now have some time for questions. If you do have a question, you'll see that all your lovely faces are now on our screens. So if you have a question, you can either pop it in the chat, or you could you could unmute yourself and ask your question directly. So we have one question in the chat. Okay, so we've got our first question. At what point should an organisation refer a bullying problem to an external source of help? Are there any criteria to help decide if a problem needs to be referred to an external organisation? That's a really good question. I'll hand it over to the panel. Any ideas on this?
I'll have a go at answering this first, Samantha.
Thank you, Kate.
No doubt there'll be others with input. I think the key thing is, as you said at the end of the panel discussion, is to first talk to somebody external and consider your options. And if it is that a investigation is needed, then it's really important to consider the principles by which an investigation should be run, which are the principles of natural justice. And one of the key things there is that the investigation needs to be run as being free from bias. And bias can be actual bias, but also the perception of bias. And if an investigation is run by somebody internal, then it can be that all parties involved may think there's a hidden agenda, or that the outcome is already predetermined, which is another thing that goes against the principles of natural justice. Of course, if you want to do something other than an investigation, which is what we're actually recommending in this discussion, there are other factors to consider. And I might just pass the ball on to Stephen or Kate to answer that aspect.
as Kate correctly noted, obviously you need to take advice and work out what your options are. One of those options will ultimately be a facilitation or a mediation process, which gets the parties together at some point along the way to talk through the issues. The one thing we've discovered, and it's one of the issues where particularly HR or senior managers have been involved in the investigation process, is a wee bit of a risk of buy-in, which is that effectively they become connected to the process itself. And it's often difficult for them to be able to provide appropriate advice, especially to the organization when it comes back to them saying, so what do we do now with this issue? So it does put them sometimes in a very tricky spot. And as Kate pointed out, that does create this kind of internal bias within the structure, which makes it much more difficult. Sometimes it's easier for HR just to be HR, just to do its role, to get on with the issues without having necessarily to have to worry about being the investigator, ultimately the decision maker, and potentially providing support to either staff or management as they move forward. So it is a tricky issue to kind of balance. And that's certainly one of the things we've seen in the mediation process, is that sometimes HR actually becomes part of the issue rather than necessarily part of the solution. General rule in any mediation process is that sooner is better. Then that is that the longer a conflict continues, the more likely it is that the problems will become much more entrenched and much more difficult to be able to address. If there was one comment I would make as an outsider who's been called into these situations, it's often too late for us. We're often being called in way too late in the process, and by the time we're involved, our ability to restore trust, to rebuild relationships has been significantly affected. So it is certainly worthwhile having these kind of conversations as early as possible. If you're thinking that maybe things are starting to get a bit wobbly, important for us to be called in as earlier rather than later. As I say, the longer you delay, the greater the risk is that the relationship will deteriorate.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Just going on to the next question, thoughts on how FairWay reports patterns of behaviour seen in organisations when mediating or facilitating conflict resolution. That's that's a big question, because obviously we've got confidentiality sitting firmly in the middle of whatever's happening there. But at FairWay, one of our key focuses is always on how can we enhance the ability of an organisation to be proactive. So any thoughts on how we balance the confidentiality of the parties involved directly in the mediation with the needs of the wider organisation?
And I guess one of the things that we do, Samantha, is that we have a close working relationship with some very large organisations, and in that context, obviously, it is possible for us to talk around some of the issues to do with some of the trends or issues that might be arising along the way. For example, one organisation, we've talked a little bit about the fact that it's clear that managers probably need training in difficult conversations, so the ability to be able to respond, as we've talked before about those issues, at the earliest possible moment, to have those difficult conversations. We can also deal with issues proactively, obviously, and that's what we've talked about before. So before the issues actually arise, we can pick those issues up as well. So we have the ability to both provide training and other support. So it is possible for us, obviously, if we have a series of issues that begin to arise within an organisation that we have a close working relationship with, we have a greater ability to sort of report on the trends without affecting the individual confidentiality of the issues that might otherwise have arisen.
I think it's also important to ensure, look, no one's going to benefit if people beyond the mediation don't learn something from it. So it's really important, I find, when we're in those processes to, before the mediation or facilitation is over, to ensure that everybody involved has agreed on what can be said outside of the meeting and who that can be shared with. I, as a matter of process and practice, ask the individuals involved if I can please speak to the HR manager, or maybe the next person up in the line, so that I can get an objective view. And the way I phrase that is, it's about getting an objective view, and I explain conflict as being in three parts to conflict. So individual, how you react, etc., the interpersonal dynamics involved between the parties in the facilitation, but also how the environment is affecting the conflict. And for me to be able to understand the environment, I need to go beyond those that are directly involved. So that's how I kind of intellectualize it as well. But this is after I've gained the trust and the consent of the people, the individuals involved.
Yeah.
And certainly, Kate, to pick up your point and possibly take it that step further, when you have this agreement at the end of a mediation or facilitation process, that's when I normally say to parties, well, this is actually where the hard work starts. And so the question is, what support do they need from management to make sure that they can stick to the agreements that they have made, and that brings management into that conversation on and sharing insights on things that have started
and even using management themselves, if they're not seen as, say, biased or part of the problem, to help that hard work become less hard as we go along, and to kind of I think at FairWay we're very big on making sure organisations are empowered almost to do ourselves out of a job. So the more that we can upskill these people on how to manage the situation going forward, and so it doesn't escalate again, the better.
Thank you. All right. So we have another question. Michelle says that she liked the mentioned process of the individual meetings prior to the team building workshop. How effective can the team workshops be when organizations are not willing to pay for individual meeting time?
This is where the selling of our services and education to the market about what's actually involved in a process, a genuinely effective process, is important. I think, like we mentioned before, often the skills that are involved in navigating difficult conversations and building team culture are underestimated until an organisation actually experiences what happens when they've failed. And I think it's about how you communicate the importance of the individual meetings prior to the team building workshop. If, for example, one of the issues is that there's an elephant in the room, there's an issue that's not being discussed, or there are like two factions or two camps, then it's very important for the facilitator of a team building workshop to understand those issues, and they can only really understand those issues when they have a meeting in private with the individuals prior to the group. It's about how you build trust. Stephen and Kate have talked a lot about tools and issues where trust has fallen away. And these are soft skills that are becoming more and more accepted as a business risk. And I think it's how you frame that to the people that are paying you. And I'm happy to have an offline conversation about how you might want to frame that, because I've been working on it quite a lot in my own practice.
The other issue is that, having worked in two contexts where there aren't these pre-mediation meetings, and that they're not possible, so within a government service, the impact of that is that you tend to push quite quickly into a settlement focus, because you're basically trying to bring the matter that's presented by both sides to a close. You don't have the context, you don't have the big picture, and so you then tend therefore to push ahead. If the organisation is genuine about trying to improve the working relationship, not only for these two individuals but for the wider team, it's absolutely essential that there's an ability to set that framework beforehand. I've had a number of parties in the last couple of weeks, literally, where we've spent time with them talking through what has happened, some of the elements, and they're really difficult questions to ask. In what way have you contributed to what's unfolded here? They're very difficult questions to ask front to front, especially if you don't already know the answer. So, the ability to be able to ask those questions in separate sessions helps to provide that a degree of self-awareness, and obviously awareness of what's happened in the background and where people have contributed or added to the problems. Without those individual meetings, the ability to be able to rebuild the relationship is much, much harder. So if the organisation genuinely wants this to move forward, then on that basis, there needs to be those individual meetings to form that foundation. And in our particular case, we also have the additional element of what's called preparation for mediation, which adds value as well.
I think it's about how sustainable do they want these solutions, the resolutions to be. And I often liken it to the Christmas bulge I'm probably going to put on before, and we'll extend it to the 26th of December. As long as it took me to put that on, it's going to take as long to get it off. So as long as it's taken for this relationship issue to build and mount, it's going to take as long to resolve it and make it, a workable relationship again. The hard work begins after a mediation facilitation, as Kate said earlier.
Yeah. So really the importance, what I'm hearing is that even though the organization is not directly a party to whatever process we're implementing, they are a party, and their buy-in and engagement is just as important as the people sitting at the table.
And it's our job as mediators, investigators, whoever we are, employment lawyers, advisors, to educate. This is part of that initial conversation about talking through options with people. It's our job to educate and explain to them not just the process that's needed, but the value of that process.
Yeah. Kate, did you have something you wanted to add?
I guess in terms of the case that I referred to, fortunately, because both of the employees were highly valued for the skill set that they brought to the workplace, I didn't have to have that sales conversation. So there was already that understanding from the organisation that they really wanted to keep both people, and they had to spend the time on those one-to-ones. But completely endorse, what Kate and Stephen have said as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions?
I think there's one more, Samantha. What is the single most important step for organisations to take after a bullying investigation?
Oh, there we go, yes.
Mental health day, maybe. I'm just going to go sing, sorry, I'll jump in. I think the most important is for someone who's not been directly involved in the investigation, who's maybe higher up in management, to come in and actually spend time with the team and just check in with them, and then engage the degree of negative impact the investigation might have had. And then you can maybe design, consider whether there needs to be anything like facilitation, and if there does, what actual process to improve team functionality again is needed.
Okay.
Yes, almost invariably, as we mentioned, things like it's the intangible pieces. It's the teamwork, the trust, the respect, all those kind of intangible issues that won't necessarily be obvious in terms of raw productivity, but they will have an impact, and they will begin to impact the communication processes. It's the ability, I guess, to acknowledge that regardless of the outcome of the process of the investigation or the review, there will be legacies here, and it's about how do we deal with those appropriately to restore the balance, reconcile the relationships, put in place some of those issues to deal with some of those intangible elements that are going to be essential moving forward.
Kate?
I guess for me, it's sort of what is the learning? Where did the relationship break down? Is there feedback into the processes and policies that you need to tweak? Again, essentially everything we've sort of explained today, upskilling where needed, and keep that conversation alive. Make your policies active and your processes active, and continually review them and tweak them and relevant for the time and space.
Yeah. And I think, if I just make that into a negative, what is the single most important thing for you not to do? I think the answer clearly is nothing. Doing nothing isn't an option when an investigation or something has happened that's had a ripple effect in your team. As our speakers spoke about today, when we do nothing, other things will fill the gap. And what we want to be doing is making sure that we're proactively thinking about what we want to come into that space that the investigation or other process has created. So I'd really like to thank our panel today. Denise, I did see your question, but unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time to come to you, but thank you for your offer. And it's been really great to see all of your faces. At FairWay, we'd like to wish you all a very happy Christmas and holiday season with your families and loved ones. I'm sure that we're all counting down the days in our diaries to get there. So we hope that you all have a really wonderful, wonderful time and time to rest and recharge. And we look forward to joining all of you again next year when our Kotahitanga series continues. So thank you to our panelists, Stephen, Kate and Kate. And thank you to all of you for making time to come along today. We really appreciated it.
Thank you, everyone.
Kia ora, everyone.
Bye.